We are grateful and we are privileged to have Byron Sugahara with us this evening in a different capacity. Rather than being one of the audience, instead he is our featured speaker. He's lived at Johns Island since 2004. In addition to that, he also has homes in Mountain Lakes, New Jersey, and cabins in the Catskills and in Canada. He first came to Florida, and you can understand when you have homes in New Jersey, Catskills, and Canada, you really want to come to Florida sometime. But the first time he ever came to Florida, he was really here because his company was shipping grapefruit to Japan. And there was a group of grapefruit growers and so on and so forth, and they played golf. And it was hot, and it was miserable. And the question he asked himself is, why would I or anyone ever want to live here? Well, he found an answer, and of course we know that Nancy, his wife, doesn't like traffic, and one of the things she really liked about Vero Beach was there was not a lot of traffic back then in 2004 when they moved to this area. But nevertheless, the group who came to see about shipping grapefruit played golf here. And that's when they found out how hot and miserable it really could be. But in addition to that, it gave them an opportunity to see a little bit of Florida that most people never see. And so fortunately for all of us, this man who lives at Johns Island and loves the variety and the friendliness of the people here and of our residents made this his home. With his family, as I said before, they've been here since 2004. Byron is an individual of many interests and talents, and when you hear the places he's traveled and the interesting things he's done in the name of international commerce and international business, it's absolutely fascinating. His hobbies are golf and fly fishing, but he will warm your hearts, many of you, when you find that really fly fishing for him means catch and release. It's only in New Zealand where they have a quota they have to get rid of at a particular lake where you're allowed to keep the trout. So, to New Zealand, which is his favorite travel destination, he would go if he wants to smoke his own trout. For hobbies other than golf and fly fishing, he didn't watch TV. I said, what do you watch on TV? He says, the Golf Channel and the Weather Channel. That's about as basic Florida as you can get, I think. His favorite kind of literature is historical fiction. And tonight you are going to hear him add just a bit of his own chapter to the historical, not necessarily fiction, but often the basis for fiction in this country, as he tells us about a part of our history which many of us do not know, but which all of us are eagerly awaiting. Byron, welcome to our party.
Thank you, Stephanie. Ladies
and friends and neighbors, I'm not used to public speaking, but I understand that you're supposed to start with something humorous. But when I Googled concentration camp jokes, I couldn't find any. So let me just get started with my talk. America's concentration camps, the who, what, when, where, how, and why, plus recollections and aftermath. You may be surprised to hear that America had concentration camps, and I'd like to address that. Perhaps you know about Japanese American internment, but they used a different term. The historical record shows that Franklin D. Roosevelt and the Secretary of Interior, Harold Ickes, called the detention centers concentration camps. I chose to use the term concentration camps because I wanted to draw attention to the gross violations of civil liberties against American citizens on American soil during my lifetime and many of yours. and I'm about to tell you more about that throughout the talk. I'll start by telling you some of the background information about my family and the greater historical context. My grandparents all immigrated from Japan in the late 19th and early 20th century. And anti-Asian sentiment and legislation had been building for years. Immigration quotas were in effect which prevented a lot of immigration. And until the McCarran-Walters Act of 1952, Asians and many other non-white immigrants could not become naturalized citizens. Those were the Issei, the first generation Japanese Americans. My parents, Yone Kuwahara and Kei Sugahara, were born here, and therefore they were citizens. They were called Nisei, which means second generation. I'm Sansei, or third generation. Yone was born in 1907 and grew up on a ranch outside of LA when the area was still quite rural. She had a sister and two brothers. She graduated from Whittier College and became a teacher. My father, Kay, was born in Seattle in 1908, the second of 5 children, but moved to the Los Angeles area as a young child. His mother died when Kay was 8, and his father died when he was 12. On his deathbed, Kay's father made the 5 children promise that none of them would get married until they all had graduated from college, and they kept that promise. They lived in Methodist orphanages, one for girls and one for boys, until they were 18, when they were forced to leave the orphanages. My father excelled in school from an early age and had a talent for rhetoric. This is a picture of an early oratorical contest team of Japanese Americans. He told me about going to out of town with his high school debate team, and after they won, pushed the wrong way. And after they won the match, they had to sneak out of town, fearing for their safety, because the townspeople didn't like the fact that they had been bested by some Japs. Kay was able to go through UCLA working in a produce market from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. weekdays and all day Saturday, and graduated in 1932. He started his own business, his own customs brokerage house in 1935, and even as a young man was prominent in the Japanese American ghetto of Japantown. He was a natural entrepreneur, so despite all the hardships and discrimination, he was a wealthy man by the time my twin brother Brian and I were born in 1940. Along with my older brother KG, we lived in this 14-room house, formerly owned by a member of the Hunt food family. When World War II came to the United States, and everything changed. For my family, it started on April 30th, 1942, with the following notice addressed to all people of Japanese ancestry. But if he'd been alive then, he would have gone too. He's a quarter Japanese American. And if Ricky Fowler had children and grandchildren at that time, even they would have been incarcerated. The rule was for anyone with 1/16 Japanese heritage. They also included Japanese American orphans. The notice told us we had to all leave the area, which included a large swath of LA County, by noon on May 7, just 1 week away. We were not allowed to move in order to escape the evacuation, and we had to observe a curfew from 8 p.m. till 6 a.m. We were given a list of requirements of items we were required to pack for each person. For each member of the family, bedding and linens, no mattress, toilet articles, extra clothing, sufficient knives, forks, spoons, plates, bowls, and cups, and essential personal effects. And for us, that probably also included diapers, the cloth kind. This was, I guess, our family in a little bit happier times. If you were going away in a week's time, not knowing where or for how long, what would you have packed in suitcases like this? Just 2 of them. And once you packed your bags, what would you do with the rest of your things? My dad leased our house to a, quote, friend, unquote, for $1 a year, who said he'd take care of it for him. Later, when my dad asked him if he had managed to sublet it for him, his so-called friend told him that rent controls had been instituted and he could not raise the rent. Kay, without any rental income, was stuck paying for the entire mortgage so he didn't lose the house. This was not atypical of the treatment internees received. Before the war, the Office of Naval Intelligence and the FBI both conducted studies about the loyalty of Japanese Americans. Kay cooperated with these investigations, which both concluded that Japanese Americans were loyal citizens. Therefore, he was quite surprised by the evacuation order. This is probably the last picture of us taken at our house in Los Angeles before we had to move. In 1942, Anise was convicted of defying the evacuation order. 41 years later, in 1983, the conviction was overturned by the Supreme Court because the U.S. government had withheld reports stating that Japanese Americans were loyal to the U.S. during his original 1942 trial. Beside his own business, my father was one of the largest hotel owners in Los Angeles. He nominally owned between 60 and 80 single-room occupancy hotels on behalf of other Japanese Americans. This is because in addition to being denied the right to become naturalized citizens, Issei, or first-generation Japanese Americans, were also unable to own property. When you are forced to relocate in 1 week's time, along with the rest of your community, and only allowed to take what you can carry in 1 suitcase per person, what do you do with your business and personal records? Your lawyers and accountants are in the same position, as is the rest of your family. So it is inevitable that some of your records will be lost. It was a huge dilemma for a lot of people that would have serious consequences down the road. We were not immediately moved to camps since they were not ready to receive us. Instead, we were sent to intermediate holding areas, which were normally racetracks or fairgrounds. Ours was Santa Anita Racetrack. Later, my mother told me my grandmother bemoaned the fact that our whole family was forced into one of the stalls that had once held my grandfather's racehorses. Santa Anita housed 18,000 internees, but it had only 6 mess halls and 150 showers when it opened. One internee recalled, shortly after arrival, one had to stand for 45 to 75 minutes for a meal. Then we had to get in line for showers and washing. And what facilities! Not only was the number very limited, but a great change in privacy, cleanliness, aesthetics, and convenience from our homes. Imagine going from a comfortable life with your family one day to being crammed into a facility like that. After a number of months, we were moved to the camps. This picture just shows some of the internees being loaded on a train. The government set aside 10 locations, 10 relocation centers, all of which were located in desolate areas, 8 in the high desert and the other 2 in the Mississippi Delta swampland. The map shows the locations of the camps, and the next slide shows the summer highs and winter lows of their temperature ranges. For people from the Los Angeles area, the movement to the high desert caused great hardship since the climatic conditions were so different from what they were accustomed. This is just an overview of the camp, and this really shows what a desolate area it was. According to the National Park Service review, while under construction, Camp Omachi opened in the end of August 1942. Still incomplete by the end of October, it had over 7,300 internees, mostly from California, who had no heavy clothing and suffered greatly that winter. A family consisting of 7 or few members was assigned to one cramped room measuring 20 by 24 feet. This is a view of an area just used for washing. This is a toilet facility. This gives you some idea of the conditions the Japanese Americans found when we got to the camps. On the bright side, we had more room than the horse stall, but the conditions were really not much of an improvement. So although it was never really what you would call comfortable, we did eventually settle down into what would be called a normal routine. This is a diagram of a living block where approximately 250 people lived. We lived in 10E, which I think we were given because we had young children, so they wanted us to be closer to the joint facilities. But remember, each of these barracks is 24 feet wide, so that gives you an idea of how far you had to go just to go to the bathroom, to wash up, to eat. While looking at the camp block diagram, I was struck by how difficult it must have been for my mother in the camps. She had to get up, stir the pot-bellied stove back to life, and then change 2 two-year-olds, and then take my 5-year-old brother and us to the communal latrines, which probably were very crowded, wash us up, and stand in line for breakfast. This was probably occurring in very cold weather, which they hadn't expected coming from Los Angeles. I note that the record cold for January 1943 in the nearby town of Granada, Colorado, was minus 24 degrees. I recall that every day she would have to take each of those dirty diapers to the communal washing area and scrub them by hand and then hang them to dry. I also remember the clean laundry hanging in our barracks. It was too windy and dusty to hang them outside in the summer and too cold in winter. My mother and most of the others, I'm sure, did a lot of mending and sewing. I remember one day Mom was hemming a pair of pants for me and my brother, and I decided to help. I put help in quotation marks because I was 3 or 4 years old and not very dexterous with the scissors. And I ended up cutting off a chunk of the leg completely. This would have upset any mother, but I'm sure it caused extra frustration because of the circumstances in which we were living. Where was she going to get another pair of pants? She just stitched it back on, and I had to wear them until I outgrew them or wore them out. As a kid, there were definitely some adventures to be had. The military soon abandoned the guard towers, and these were extraordinarily appealing to us. Climbing the ladder was an exploit in itself, and there was a secret clubhouse at the top. I remember one time my brothers and I had caught a horny toad, one of those spiky desert lizards, and a tortoise, and carried them up to the tower in a bucket. We left them overnight, and when we came back the next day, the horny toad was gone, but the tortoise looked mighty satisfied. Eventually, we were allowed off the grounds during the day, and I remember seeing deep tracks where wagons had once taken settlers west. I believe they were part of the Santa Fe Trail. Many of the adults were eventually able to carry on with their pre-war professions. In his book, Concentration Camps on the Home Front, author John Howard writes, quote, "Meanwhile, both to spread budgets and to encourage self-reliance among those confined, WRA officials employed inmates to perform most tasks in the camp. Employees were paid a flat rate of $14 a month for ordinary workers, capped at $19 a month for doctors and dentists, a scale deliberately set lower than the minimum pay for GIs. There was a wartime shortage of medical personnel, but we had Japanese American doctors and nurses, plus some Caucasian nurses. The doctors earned a mere $19 per month, while the Caucasian nurses earned $150 a month. This caused discipline problems, and I'm sure depressed some doctors. I imagine they had bought homes based on what they had earned prior to internment. How would they pay their mortgages out of their meager pay? As for education, no schoolrooms had been built, although makeshift schools were set up later. Also, a high school was built over the opposition of many of the local residents who had not seen a new school building for years. However, it should be noted that the student-teacher ratio for grammar schools in the camps was 48-1, and the high school was 35-1. At that time, the national average for the United States class size was 28-1. I can't say I remember much about the food, though it couldn't have been very good. To quote John Howard again, "To save money and defend against charges that the inmates were being coddled, daily food costs were limited to a maximum of 45 cents per inmate. As a result of such chintzy budgets, plus inexperienced inmate cooks, the food was poor in both quality and nutrition, at least until the inmates could produce their own produce." Camp Omachi had a population that was at least 50% farmers, and they were allowed to work. They farmed the land on the Arkansas riverbank and produced enough produce to not only feed the Camp Omachi population, but also export produce to other camps and the U.S. Army. Camp Omachi was the smallest of the 10 camps, but produced more food than any other camp. I believe this was in large part due to Colorado Governor Carr's stance on the incarceration of Japanese Americans. Because of his welcoming attitude toward us, the administration of the camp was more congenial than that of any other. I do recall a funny story my mom shared. One day, someone in the camps got wind of a shipment of squid that had arrived in the town, and everyone there was dismayed. But we considered it a delicacy, and were able to trade some meat that we had for the squid. We were excited for this rare treat. Purely by chance, the day they served the squid was the day the War Relocation Authority sent inspectors to see about the conditions of the camp. When they went to the mess hall and saw the squid being served, they were appalled and said they would recommend better food services for the inmates. My father, though he had fought against the injustice of the incarceration, decided that he must talk to the young men of draft age about where their allegiance lay. He told them, "Even though you have been treated unfairly because of racial prejudice, you must decide if you're American or Japanese. Where else but America can the orphaned children of a despised minority put themselves through university, get jobs, and start their own business? You must prove to the rest of Americans that the Japanese Americans are loyal citizens, and therefore you should volunteer for the draft." Not surprisingly, there was some opposition. They retorted, "It's easy for you to say. You're beyond draft age and have 3 children." So he applied for and was accepted by the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, which was the precursor to the CIA. He served in the China-Burma India Theater, working on black morale operations designed to weaken the morale of the Japanese armed services and people. Camp Omachi had a larger percentage of draft age males volunteer for the draft than any other camp. In total, 33,000 Japanese Americans served in World War II. This was 12.35% of all persons of Japanese heritage. For all Americans, only 8.97% of the population served. The most famous Japanese American unit was the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, which was the most decorated unit of its size in the war. Here they get a unit citation from President Truman, and I thought what he said to them was very important. "You fought not only the enemy, but fought prejudice, and you won. Keep up that fight, and we will continue to win, to make this great republic stand for what the Constitution says it stands for." I go give you a little bit of a legal case. It's called Ex Parte Endo, Why the Camps Close. Ms. Mitsuya Endo, with the help of a civil rights attorney, filed a habeas corpus suit in 1942. Her suit was denied, but on appeal, the appeals court ruled in her favor, and it was eventually sent to the Supreme Court. The court heard her on October 11th, 1944, but they delayed the decision, which was 9-0 in her favor, until December 18th, 1944. This was after the 1944 presidential election, and one day after the exclusion order was rescinded by the Western Defense Command. I've just told you a bit about the who, what, and when, so now you're probably wondering, how did this happen and why? On February 19th, 1942, Franklin Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066, which gave the Secretary of War and subordinate commanders the right to exclude any or all persons from designated military areas. Most of the U.S. West Coast was so designated. It should be noted that Attorney General Francis Biddle had twice objected to it on legal constitutional grounds. J. Edgar Hoover the head of the FBI, objected to it by saying he had rounded up the estimated 1,600 people who might be enemy agents, and that the other Japanese Americans were loyal citizens. And General George Marshall, Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, thought it was a waste of military manpower to incarcerate many loyal citizens. Most Western state governors, and especially the governor of California, as well as the California Attorney General, Earl Warren, advocated strongly for the incarceration on defense grounds. This despite the fact that the governor of Hawaii, where Japanese Americans were 35% of the total population, and many more than in California, very successfully argued against the incarceration of Japanese Americans. Here is a quote from Personal Justice Denied, the report of the Bipartisan Commission on Wartime Internment of Civilians of 1982, commissioned by the U.S. Congress. In sum, Executive Order 9066 was not justified by military necessity, and the decisions which followed from it were not founded upon military considerations. The broad historical causes which shaped these decisions were race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. My personal belief is that a small segment of the population used racial prejudice and wartime hysteria for personal gain. In the case of Earl Warren, it was to get elected governor of California in the 1942 election. But for others, it was to take away the fruits of many years of hard labor under discriminatory laws. Austin Anson, the managing secretary of the Salinas Grower Shipper Vegetable Association, a Caucasian farm organization, said in an interview with the Saturday Evening Post while he was in Washington lobbying for the incarceration, "We're charged with wanting to get rid of the Japs for selfish reasons. We might as well be honest. We do. It's a question of whether the white man lives on the Pacific coast or the brown man." It should be noted that the Japanese American population of California was never 3% of the total population. Japanese American business owners and homeowners face similar depredations of their assets. Here is a quote from Milton Eisenhower, the first head of the Wartime Relocation Authority and younger brother of Dwight D. Eisenhower, in 1974. "I have brooded about this whole episode on and off the past 3 decades, for it is illustrative of how an entire society can somehow plunge off course." I'd also like to point out that the executive order was published on February 19th, but the evacuation didn't commence until early May. I don't think this was coincidental, that this was just before the crops were ready for harvest. Since many farmers borrowed against the crops they would harvest, this ensured the Japanese American farmers would be in dire financial straits. Thus, it would be easier to obtain their land. This graph just shows the percentage of vegetables of different crops that the Japanese Americans produced in 1940. In 1940, the Japanese Americans controlled 458,000 acres of farmland, of which they owned 226,000. The owned was 3.9% of all farms, 2.7% of all land harvested. The value of the Japanese American farms was roughly $280 an acre. The average value of farmland in California was $38 an acre. It's estimated that the value of the farms and their equipment was $72 million on the owned land only. They produced 40% of all the vegetables in California. In 1942, 88% of the land was confiscated or sold under duress. In Hawaii, which had a population that was 35% Japanese of Japanese heritage, which was about 158,000 people, and was 2,000 miles closer to Japan than the U.S. West Coast was, there was no mass evacuation and no acts of sabotage or espionage. In fact, business interests felt that the economy could not be sustained if Japanese Americans were interned. After the war, many of the internees had problems adjusting to their new lives after the internment. We moved to the East Coast, and my father struggled to set up a new business, but was not very successful. He asked his psychiatrist why this was so. The psychiatrist answered, "Subconsciously, you were still mad at the U.S. government for the incarceration. So you decided not to be successful so you wouldn't have to pay taxes to the government. Don't you think you're harming your family more than the government?" Many others who had been interned had similar misgivings and bad feelings about the internment, which would often take many decades to resolve. Well after the war was over, the results of the hurried evacuation were still being felt by my father because the IRS was still after him for the lack of records for the years 1940 and 41. Remember that he had been a customs broker, and U.S. law required that all duty paid by the owners of the goods be paid by the owners of the goods and not by any customs broker. Thus he had had large sums in his accounts which were not his. And further, he had nominally owned 60 to 80 hotels, which were beneficially owned by Issei. So he did not have the records to show that the funds received from the rents of these properties were for others' benefits. But the IRS was relentless, so after the Korean War, my father's lawyer advised him to make a settlement with the IRS. So he made a settlement in the end of '57. The settlement was for the next 5 years, 1958 to '63, he pays normal taxes up to $11,000 of annual income. For amounts above $11,000, he pays normal income tax plus 90% of the remainder. So when my twin brother and I graduated from high school in 1958, things were pretty tight in the Sugahara household. Not only were our folks paying for our older brother, KG, to study at Caltech, but two of us really did a number on the food budget. Don't let my trim and boyish figure fool you. I could really put it away at the dinner table back then. I considered going into the Army to help pay for school, but luckily Brian and I both received scholarship offers from our top choice school, which was Harvard. I think they wanted a way to quickly increase their diversity. The two of us made up 20% of the Asian population of our class. Also, we found that identical twins were in high demand as paid subjects for medical and psychological tests, and we earned a lot of beer money that way. Shortly after I graduated from college in the '60s, I went to visit Los Angeles, and my parents told me to stop in and see their best friends from before the war. The Moritas had returned from Omachi to Los Angeles and had restarted a very successful wholesale produce business. Mr. Morita asked me to play golf with him, his son and his son-in-law. We went to a public course, and the foursome ahead of us was acting like jerks. And they had allowed over one hole to open up in front of them. So I told Mr. Morita that I would tell them to shape up. But Mr. Morita said, We can't talk to Caucasians like that. That's when I finally understood what my mother had been telling us for years. She used to say, sometimes what you think is the worst thing that could happen turns out to be the best. If we had not been sent to the camps, you'd have grown up much better off materially, but grown up in a ghetto with a ghetto mentality. Finally, some redress came from during the Reagan administration. My father's business had developed by then. We had a large fleet of tankers and were running other shipping enterprises. The redress funds, which would have been very welcome in the 60s when we were going to college, did not mean nearly as much to me then. But I certainly appreciated the sentiments expressed by the president. So the question I leave you with is, how do we protect our constitutional rights when some perhaps momentous occurrence is being used as an excuse to take those rights? Thank you.
That was terrific.
Yeah, thank you.
Excellent.
I don't know if any questions could possibly follow that wonderful and interesting story. But Canada had internment also, didn't it?
Yes, it did.
And how did that vary from the internment in America, and what were its reasons?
I think Canada, much like the U.S. West Coast, had a strong racial prejudice against Orientals, and that was the reason it was through. I'm not really familiar with all of the Canadian camps. I know they had them, but I was aiming my talk more at what I went through.
You mentioned that the internments were only for certain people on the West Coast. Can you tell us why you don't think internment happened to Japanese Americans in other parts of our country?
Well, the law was that the government could exclude anyone they wanted from designated military areas, and only the West Coast was a designated military area. So the exclusion only applied to people living in those areas. If you had moved out before the order, outside of the exclusion zone, you were quite all right. Although after the exclusion zone was put into effect, to move out of the camps, you had to have a sponsor and various other things.
What was the official explanation given to you for the internment? I don't mean to you personally, but to the Japanese.
Just that the West Coast was a designated military area and you were excluded from it. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court, in their original ruling, said that that was constitutional. And I guess many people today still worry about that. because when they overturned the decision of the Nisei who violated the evacuation order, they only ruled very narrowly on his case that the government had withheld information, and that's why he was interned. They did not rule on whether or not it is legal to imprison people without habeas corpus, although the habeas corpus case of ex parte ende was a little different because she had proved her loyalty in other ways.
The last question is a tough one. Do you believe that there's any similarity between what happened to your family and to others during the period that you discussed and the hysteria that is meeting against certain religious and racial minorities in the United States today?
Yes, I know one conservative commentator commented that they thought because of the precedent of the incarceration that it should be done against other people. And I think she meant the Muslims. But that's why my question was, you know, when some momentous occurrence is used as an excuse to take your rights, to break our Constitution, then I think it's something we have to say, we don't allow this.
Were U.S. citizens interned in Japan or Germany, or were they treated similarly?
I think that there were exchange programs for American citizens in Germany and Italy and Japan, and for Japanese citizens and German citizens and Italian citizens in the States to be repatriated. And in fact, I read that many Swedish ships were used just to go back and forth between the Far East and the U.S. and between Europe and the U.S. carrying citizens.
Byron, we thank you very much for a very touching and beautiful story.
Thank you.
It was terrific, absolutely.
Thank you.